And I can remember, I could just remember.
Yesterday's Witness.
I'll never forget this. It was the most extraordinary scene.
A series which explores living memory.
Some of my memories go back to
The situation in those days was...
I think looking back.
I remember. I was there.
We spoke so that you didn't move your lips. So this man says, "What's your name?" Says, "Friends." "What's yours?" "Joe." "How long have you got?" 10 years. "How long have you got?" 10 years. "What are you in for?" And it's conscience objector. "What the bloody hell's that?" So I tried to explain. All this took a long while, of course. I said, "What are you in for, Joe?" "Murder." I said, "That's funny, isn't it?" "What's funny?" I said, "Well, you've got 10 years for killing somebody. Now, I expect you were drunk. And I've got 10 years because I won't kill anybody."
In the First World War, 6,000 conscientious objectors were sent to prison. The prisoners of conscience objected on humanitarian, religious, and political grounds. Most of the objectors were socialists, and the pacifist objectors were mainly Quakers, or Friends as they called themselves. They had begun by opposing the introduction of conscription, and now they found themselves handed over to the military. Lydia Smith worked for the objectors' own organization. She regularly heard reports of army brutality.
The prison warders were obviously, well, criminals, and the worst type. They beat the men up with steel rods. The whole life there was so terrible that the soldiers, the number of Canadians were there, they were dipping their fingers in the buckets for there was no lavatory, there were just the buckets in the cell, and putting it on their eyes to become blind, and the idea that they would get out through blindness. Our men suffered, these men we knew suffered extremely badly, but it was a short-term imprisonment, and when they got out, they were able, some of them, to come back to England, and there they made very careful statements, which we had recorded and checked, and we sent them to the Commander-in-Chief, who said that he thought that the facts stated were perfectly accurate, but we must realize that unless the prisons were worse than the front line, he wouldn't be able to keep men in the front line.
Many of the intransigent objectors in the military prisons received such long sentences that they were classed as convicts and were turned over to the civil prisons. There they became a highly organized and articulate body, such as English prisons had never seen before.
When I was in prison, there was a prohibition to you to talk to another convict under any circumstances. Now, the great evil of that was that it simply couldn't be observed. One had to talk. Everybody did talk, and everybody knew that undercover, one used to speak out of the side of one's mouth according to which side the screw was. You spoke on the other side, but everybody knew it went on. And the great evil of the thing was, looking back now and comparing it with a recent prison sentence that I've done, was that you were completely at the mercy of the warder.
Silence rule always has existed, ever since I was in the prison. In fact, it was a torture to see men be silent. The least mumble of their lips, and the officer thought to retire, he must run them in. And as a matter of fact, the prison officer himself had to be silent, so that it was difficult for the prisoners and it was difficult for the officers.
After a time, our conscientious objectors, being mostly very delightful people, were rather like schoolboys. And they spoke surreptitiously when the warder was turned, you see. His back was turned. We got a word in. And the old lags, the criminal prisoners, were so used to it, some of them, that they devised a plan of conversation during hymns to the tune of "Jesus loves me, this I know." They'd say, how are you getting on, old bloke, you see.
And I came into chapel beside Arthur Haycock, who was subsequently MP for Salford. I stood beside him, and when it came to the hymn, what I heard coming from Haycock's lips was, "Have you heard that George Benson came in yesterday?" That was the chap who's now Sir George Benson. He was not a Manchester man, too.
We had other means of communication. We had a hot pipe system going from cell to cell and even going to the floors above. We had a complete telephone situation. We all learned the Morse code in reverse, and by tapping on the pipe and giving the number of the cell we wanted, it was exactly like a telephonic communication. We could even be put onto the floor above. But all the time, there was the danger of being discovered, of being reported, of bread and water, and one always had a certain amount of fear of this. And I came to the conclusion that we ought to resist the silence rule openly. And for 10 wonderful days in Liverpool prison, we ran our hall. There would be about 60 conscientious objectors there. We made our own rules. We talked openly. And when we went on exercise, instead of marching round in a circle 5 feet behind each other, we went arm in arm and talked. We were shut in our cells. We made our own rules when there would be silence for reading. Every night we had concerts and lectures by someone speaking through an open window, and his voice could be heard the whole length. This had a serious effect upon other prisoners, and after 10 days, the 5 leaders of what was described as a mutiny were deported to other prisons.
If there were any difficulties in prison, and we had one or two, troubles of warders misbehaving in our view, and it was possible to get questions asked in the House of Commons the same afternoon. And after that had been done a few times, we established a sense of contact with the outside, which needed to be regarded by the prison authorities. It wasn't fair on them, I grant you, but it gave us a great sense of being in contact.
Visitors helped them to get messages in and out of prison. The No Conscription Fellowship, which was the objectors' organization, published the smuggled information in their journal, The Tribunal. The authorities did all they could to suppress it, imprisoning staff and smashing machinery.
When the police went to dismantle, as they call it, the second printer, they were jubilant. They said they did very thoroughly. He wasn't able to start again, and said, "No, that'll be the end of that." And therefore, when we came out, but here we are again. And Scotland Yard took it very badly. And for a whole, nearly 18 months, they tried to find out how we printed it and where we printed it and who was doing it. They took a room opposite us, opposite the office in the Adelphi. We knew that, we saw them going in and out, and kept watching us. I don't know if they watched at night as well as day, but I hardly think they would do that. But they never found out, partly because they were so convinced that I was sending in for a man. They couldn't believe it. I think I looked very young in those days, and they couldn't believe that I was the editor. They didn't believe it for a moment. They never found out how the material came to me and how I got it to the printer. Actually, every week, an old lady slipped down the stairs as though she was going to see the caretaker. Then the old lady slipped up, passed, and I gave her the copy, and away she went. And never did they find her. Never did they. So that we were able to come out every week right up to the end of the war, and indeed afterward.
Many of the prisons had their own underground publications. The Winchester Whisperer was edited by Alfred Coram.
I started that as a prison paper, of course quite surreptitiously, and it ran for some 12 or 13 issues, one every month or so. It was made up on toilet paper, which I had a small piece of copying pencil, which I wrote, in which I wrote out the material and then damped it. And then I handed it to somebody who bound it, and it was circulated by hand. There was some very good material in it because there were some very good people in prison. The authorities got wind of it and made 2 or 3 thorough searches of the prison, but they never discovered it. The chaplain, who came round one evening, he came round on press night, And I had the whole issue hung up behind my cell door on lines to dry. And he opened the door and came in. Are you all right? Yes. What are you reading? Oh, the Bible, yes. And banged the door and went out. He little knew how near he was to discovering the Winchester Whisperer.
The authorities unwittingly provided paper for their publications, but pencil leads had to be smuggled in.
We found one way by which even when you were stripped you could get leads into prison by putting them under the arch of the foot. And I stepped into the bath. To my horror, the water began to go purple. I'd got purple leads. And when the warder came and saw the water purple, he told off a prisoner who fortunately was a conscientious objector for having put disinfectant in the water, said I was not a hospital case. And so I got away with it.
Most of us, although we were inclined to be anarchistic, recognised that the warders had a job to do. And we were prepared to see that they were never let down because of our conduct. After all, they have their own hierarchy, and when the chief warder is round on inspection, then he expects that the warders will be at attention and that everything in their charge will be in order. And the warders soon discovered that we were prepared to back them in this display of discipline. I mean, there was nothing to it. And by and large, they ceased to be, shall we say, afraid of us?
In the prison where I was, I found that about half the warders were members of the Independent Labour Party. And that was especially true of the workmaster who looked after the prison painting and repairs and decoration, all that sort of thing. And men who worked in his squad saw the Labour Party papers every week.
I had one particular occasion where a warder sent some extremely valuable information, including a rule book, which, of course, if it had been found, had been sent out of the prison, he would instantly have lost his job. And it came to us at the NCF, and we were able to put various things right.
I've an instance, the case, for example, of one warder who became almost converted to the pacifist point of view, and with whom I had quite a friendly relationship. In fact, he used to open my cell door early in the morning and slip in his daughter's homework for me to check.
That was at Wandsworth. My mother brought me a rose from the garden, but they took it from me. I don't know whether they thought I'd cut my throat with it or what.
Our prison adjoined a women's prison, and the wardresses used to come through periodically for a chat with some of the warders. And from my cell window, when I heard the voices outside, I used to stand on my stool for the pleasure of just looking at this woman's face. Because it is an extraordinary thing being shut away. Apart from when my fiancée came down and visited me, I never saw a woman all those years. And she didn't come very often because we found the conditions of prison visiting, talking to two grills with a stranger present all the time, we found it intolerable.
One had to stand in a series of horse boxes, well, they looked like horse boxes, prepared for the visitors. And between you and, in my case, my husband, the double wire, that was the same with all the prisoners, with their relatives. And a warder was walking up and down to hear if you said anything that you shouldn't. It was absolute starvation so far as an opportunity for real converse.
I suppose the first effect was that after a time one began to suffer a sort of mental and nervous hibernation. That's to say, one's senses became dulled, one accepted the routine, one ceased to think or react very much, one lost one's consciousness of unity with the world outside. One adapted oneself to the prison environment and made the best of it.
Well, I never was got down by tedium. I could always find something to do. Even before we got to the stage of the convict prison where we were on the local side, I'd do daft things like counting up all the letters in the Bible and making a list to show their frequencies.
I did a lot of piano practice
some of it sitting on the on my bedboard with the mattress on my knee and doing like this, you see, and some of it on when there was a table.
I invented a little football game with buttons.
I learned Spanish and had quite a number of communicants within the prison to whom I used to send letters in Spanish and get letters back, all illegally, of course.
I wrote on toilet paper and in the back pages of a book a sonata for violin and for piano, which is this. This is the. It is dated, as you'll see, Winchester 1917, Plymouth 1920, completed in 1920. It's never had any success, but because I've never got anybody to study it. There were other works as well. I managed to get out on scraps of toilet paper, string quartet and so on. Mm-hmm.
After a time, I found that my powers of concentration and memory, which had both been very good at school, were declining. I could read a chapter of a book and then not know very much about what I'd been reading. I could learn something and the next day I'd forgotten it.
Do you know that this is a very strange fact? I suppose we were allowed, when we were behaving, one book a week. When we were misbehaving, as I was in solitary confinement, one book a month. And I suppose in the 3 years I must have read hundreds of books. I couldn't give you the names of half a dozen of them. I sometimes now read a book, and then I kind of feel I've read this before. I studied astronomy. I'd stand on my stool and watch the stars. I know nothing about astronomy now. Everything in my mind, which I read in prison, has gone. When one only had one book a month, one used to choose the largest books. I went right through Chambers' Encyclopedia, by getting one volume out each month, a complete volume of Shakespeare's plays, and so on and so on.
Well, it became so grave, the effect on him. Nothing in the way of a broken mind, but a broken nervous system. He remained himself and complete control of himself right to the very end. But he became expressionless. Nothing, I said when I visited, could move that static look.
After a while, we had certain concessions that Winston Churchill had created for the suffragettes, which included 2 days, 2 talking exercises of about half an hour every day. And as I watched the other chaps come on to this concession, the way that the drawn look in their faces lessened and they looked more relaxed, I shall never forget.
There were other concessions. The Home Office scheme was one of them.
The Home Office scheme, which we began to hear about when we were in prison, was an attempt to satisfy the public, or at least the liberal-minded people, that we were being given a chance to get out of prison and satisfy the other requirement that we should be serving the country, I suppose, although it was only a face-saving affair.
Men in prison were brought before a session of the Central Tribunal, which met in Wormwood Scrubbs Prison, and if they were judged genuine, were given the opportunity of doing this work at Dartmoor and various other places.
We were all engaged there, more in looking after ourselves than anything else. We kept an army of warders there. I went down there because I thought it was the least kind of work that would help the war in any way.
We were taken from the prison and put in all sorts of odd clothing and sent up to Scotland to a quarry place near Aberdeen called Dice, which had been, it was in a way a worked out quarry. There were great lumps of granite about which were ready to be crushed in great granite crushers and suitable for road making.
The shovels and the spades and the picks and that all had lead down the shafts, the handles of them, so that they should be heavy, you see. And that was part of the hard labour, I suppose, that the convicts underwent. We did a lot of stone breaking while we were there, just as the convicts would have done. We went out onto the moor on agricultural work and dug in fields. It took 100 or so of us to dig a huge field, which could have been ploughed in a few hours almost, but there again it was the kind of work they put us to, wasteful employment.
Many of us are very uneasy about the whole business, and so we said after a bit we weren't going to continue with this. So we wrote to the Home Office and said we weren't satisfied to continue under this. Would they arrange for us to go back to prison?
In fact, the stonebreakers at Dice discovered that they had been hoodwinked into building a military road.
The objection to it is, of course, that any work imposed under a Military Service Act is primarily intended to assist the nation in the conduct of the war, and perhaps even more important, that to accept obligations under a Military Service Act was to recognise the legality of the act, to recognise the right of the state to force military service not only upon oneself but upon other people as well.
When I came out of prison, one of my left leg was paralysed, and I had to have about 6 months convalescence.
I went down with what ultimately proved to be surgical tuberculosis. They never got it diagnosed properly in the prison. I had to wait till I came out. But what happened was ultimately I couldn't bend this leg, and I can't bend this arm. It was in the leg and arm, and I had to be. I was discharged on that.
My eyesight was affected for a time, though it did, in the main, recover after release.
I remember the amusing features of prison life, rather than any suffering. Probably because one wants to close one's mind to it.
After half a century, the objectors seem to recall little of the misery and hardship of that time. But the 1921 figures speak for themselves. 73 conscientious objectors had died and 31 had gone mad. But no one knows how many survived, broken in health.
The strange thing about a war, I feel, always about that war, is that among people who in ordinary life don't put up with a great deal of hardship without screaming about it, did put up with an enormous amount of hardship, showed an enormous amount of courage, and you got an incredible amount of bravery, which in fact resulted in about 20 million deaths, and that's that.
The authorities began to release the objectors under an amnesty in spring 1919. There were furious cries from the press that these men were snatching plum jobs from the nation's heroes.
I got several jobs, but always when I was interviewed by a committee or others, they would say, "Oh, by the way, Miss Taylor, what did you do in the Great War?"
They applied unsuccessfully to a few schools. Some of them sent back sympathetic notes, but said they dare not take me on.
We had a great meeting of those who had been resistors to decide our future. I think we rightly decided to dissolve the No Conscription Fellowship, but two committees were left, one of which was to seek civil liberties, rights of conscience, and the other to carry on the struggle against conscription and war.
After the war, I thought I'd got to do something positive for a bit, and so I joined in the Friends War Victims Relief work, because conditions in Germany and Austria were very bad indeed following the blockade, and so I gave pretty well 3 years to that.
My main activity at that moment was as Joint Secretary of the Prison System Inquiry Committee. Mrs. Webb came to me and said her nephew, Stephen Hobhouse, was editing it, and he had built up a mountain of evidence.
And he undertook at first by himself under the Labour Research Department to start the book, and it was terrific. He had no secretary, no typewriter. It was a terrific job. Well, then, fortunately, Fenner Brockway was asked to assist, and they worked together for many, many months.
English Prisons Today was produced with the minimum of official cooperation. It was the biggest and most objective review of prison conditions ever produced.
There's a very good story about that. Bernard Shaw was to write the preface, and he said there was nothing to do with incurable criminals except put them into a lethal chamber. My friend Stephen Hobhouse, who was a Quaker, said he couldn't possibly put his name to a book which had that preface. Shaw then rewrote these passages, and he said there were two possible ways of dealing with incurable criminals. One was to put them in a lethal chamber. The other was to find Quakers to look after them for the rest of their lives.
I think all of us came to realize, and I certainly did, that prison was no real punishment. It was no real corrective, and it had practically no element of reform. We were able to stand up to it because we had a background, we had a fellowship within the prison itself, which is denied to the ordinary prisoner.
And for the first time, the ordinary prisoner had an authoritative voice raised on his behalf against the sterility of the prison system.
There were quite a number of prison reforms. Perhaps the most important, the abolition of the silence rule, against which we had protested.
Looking at it from now, I would say that we demonstrated that it is impossible to break the spirit of men who are really convinced. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have written conscientious objection permanently into the law of England.
If one regards the state as a merely human institution, liable to all sorts of failures and errors, then one adopts a critical attitude and places the authority of conscience before that of the state. This point of view, of course, has been strengthened internationally by the judgments of the Nuremberg Tribunal, which, of course, laid it down that in the case of war crimes, a man cannot plead obedience to the state or the law or his superior officers as a defence against any crime which he may commit, that each person is morally responsible for his own acts. And this, in fact, is an endorsement of the position of the conscientious objector, though it was not intended as such by the judges at Nuremberg.
When the Military Training Act was introduced before the last World War, the government made it clear that they did not want to repeat the experience and be guilty of the persecution during the First World War. And undoubtedly in the Second World War, the conscientious objectors were treated more generously. It not only had its effect on liberty for conscience in this country, but I think all over the world.
I have every sympathy with the young Americans, principally those in Sweden and those who are in prison in America who are taking this stand today. I think there is a parallel between their situation today and mine in those days. I feel that I don't like to be arrogant about it, but I feel that we did pioneer something, we did start something.
The first thing is to find out what the law says. Read the law and figure it out. And there are agencies that will help you, which gives me an opportunity to show you the handbook for conscientious objectors. It's the Bible for COs.
If you don't fight it through as a civilian, or if they take you anyway, in spite of all your declarations and statements, fight like hell once you're in. Do everything you can to turn other GIs off, and eventually, when it comes down to a direct order to go to the scene of the fighting, walk. In other words, if you wait till you're on the battlefield of Vietnam, and then you disobey an order, firing squad, possible.